Right, there we go. Welcome back, everyone, to the 2025 Winter Learning Series. My name is Dana Ripper. I'm with the Missouri River Bird Observatory, and here also from the MRBO is Ethan Duke. Our mission is conservation via science, education, and advocacy. I'm not going to give a huge long introduction. You can find out all about the organization on mrbo.org and go to our YouTube channel as well, where we have tons and tons of good content. So I want to, as always, thank our funders, the Conservation Federation of Missouri's David Risberg Memorial Grant Fund, that is funding this for the second year, and also definitely our supporters of MRBO. You all keep the lights on around here, quite literally. So as folks who have been with us before know, we host these learning sessions with the hope that they will help you become more informed and involved and inspired to take action on behalf of our native ecosystems and all of the wildlife with which we share those ecosystems. So tonight, to help us learn more about some of these species, some of which I haven't seen Jenn's presentation yet, but I think probably when we're talking about predators and scavengers, sometimes they're unfairly maligned. So I'm looking forward too to learning more about them from Jenn Rader. Jenn Rader is a naturalist and director of the Southeast Kansas Nature Center for the Wildlife Education Services section of the Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks. She has a background in conservation and biodiversity and is a past president of the Kansas Ornithological Society. So Jenn, looking forward to your presentation. Please take it away.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dana. And thanks to MRBO for inviting me. So I'm excited to get a chance to talk to you all. We'll go ahead and dive right in. And hopefully stuff works on my end here. So hopefully you're seeing a slide change, but real quickly, I wanted to give you guys a little glimpse of what it is we're going to go over this evening, and then a little extra something that you guys can do, particularly in the chat, even though I'm probably not going to see all of it, is if you wanted to test your identification skills, I've left the majority of my scavenger and predator photos unidentified to start with. And so if you guys happen to know what any of these are, go ahead and throw those in the chat. But this is just a little overview of what we're going to talk about. And we're going to dive right in. And in case you didn't know what this one was, this is the greater roadrunner. So first and foremost, I want to give you guys a little bit of background on what it is I do, as well as provide a couple of disclaimers. So part of my job with Department of Wildlife and Parks is to interpret nature and processes of biology to the general public. So I will give this information freely from the get-go. I am not an expert in scavengers or predators biology necessarily, but I do have a background in conservation and biodiversity through Fort Hays, and we're working closely with folks that do have these specializations to help others understand why these things are important, not just to us, but to their ecosystems. And one of the points of this presentation is to help you understand more about the natural world that we're a part of and encourage critical thinking to address the challenges that biota and humans face. So one of the things that I want to make very clear, this isn't a presentation that's like anti-predator hunting or trying to push forth any hypotheses in particular. We're actually hoping that you guys will delve into learning different perspectives on what scientists are studying regarding these species. So, and again, for anybody that's wanting to identify the species in the background, we have some incredible predators, and those would be orcas. So just a little sidebar, they can take down the largest animals in the world. So blue whales. All right, so what are predators and scavengers? Predator, we're going to focus in particular on the carnivorous kind, so animals that hunt and kill other animals. There are other types of predation that are recognized, but we're going to stick with that carnivore group. Another thing that we're going to mention is keystone species, which I assume most of you are familiar, but basically when we're talking about keystone species, it's an animal or organism that has disproportionately, significant impact on a lot of other species in the ecosystems they're found. So here we've got some examples of some predators that are considered keystone species. And then we're also going to touch on the scavenger group. So these are animals that are eating other animals or decomposing plant or other organic material. So, and again, there are groups of these that are considered keystone species in their ecosystems. So a few other things that we're going to address as part of this presentation that I want to give a few terms on are ecology, and hopefully most everybody's familiar with this, but it's a branch of the biology where it focuses on the relationships that species have with the other species and their physical environment. Another word that's going to come up, or a term, is what's called trophic cascade. And this can be a little bit on the controversial side. Not everybody feels the same way about it. But in general, this is a term that's a little bit newer. And it was coined, I believe, by a zoologist named Robert Payne. And it's when top predators can indirectly affect species at lower levels of trophic at lower trophic levels, like within a food web. So their presence or absence in that web can make some pretty profound effects on other species. Another one that's going to pop up that might be unfamiliar to a few people is called a fission fusion species or society. So, and basically, it's a species that exhibits social behavior where they will be in a large group and then split into smaller subgroups for a specific reason, depending on environmental conditions of some sort. And then at some point later, they'll re-merge or fuse back together. So we can see this in our own species. So humans are a species that uses fission fusion society. Elephants, chimpanzees, several bat species, orangutans, some species of herding ungulates, a whole host of them. So that's what we're talking about with that. Something else that might pop up a little bit later is something called a mesopredator. And this one's a little bit different. It doesn't have a standard definition because it's a very fluid situation, but in general, most mesopredators are considered mid-sized and mid-level trophic level species. So think of animals like raccoons, foxes, possums. Those are generally considered mesopredator. And then we want to make sure everybody's familiar with that term biodiversity. So it's a shortened version of biological diversity. And it's just all the variety of life in all levels, all over the planet. So, and for those of you, again, keeping track of the species here, these are photos of critters I took. Most everybody should know what this one is up at the top, the bald eagle. And then we've got an American alligator I saw in Texas one time and a spotted orb weaver that was on my porch this last fall. So why are these organisms so often vilified? Long history of this for basically as long as humans have existed, right? So one of the biggest reasons is a competition for resources. So a perfect example of that, particularly when Europeans started colonizing North America, had to do with a competition for resources. So we really did not want to have to compete with other predators for game species or other resources. So a couple of examples here, but you can throw in a lot of different resources that we compete with, predators and scavengers. Another one is conflict with human assets. So, and some of these are going to actually be very closely related to each other as we go through them. But one of the largest conflicts that we deal with and have for the last couple of hundred years with particular assets or property, basically, is conflict with livestock. So that one's a big one. Another one, very much related to these and also part of a competition for resources, has to do with agricultural expansion. So a scenario here was we've got lovely photo of the Flint Hills and probably a good example of what things looked like before large settlement occurred. And then we see what happens when we've changed the landscape through our land use. And so that's an area where we see a lot of conflict with wildlife as well. Okay, another big one is just overall lack of knowledge about the species. So again, we can go back to the time periods when immigrants were settling into this land, and they didn't know anything about the species they were seeing. It's the first time they've seen them, and so they didn't really understand what it meant to start wiping these animals out. The other thing is that it's very dependent too on the timeline of ecological understanding. So any of you that are familiar with some of the principles of ecology, you may also know that ecology, the study of it, it's a little bit newer in the scheme of things. So most of what we know about ecology now happened in the second half of the 20th century. Cultural and religious beliefs are another big reason. And again, we know of like competition for resources and the feelings that people had about animals for thousands of years. So an example of this would be on the religious side of things. You know, some religions all across the world, they have very specific beliefs, and animals symbolize something. Sometimes it's positive, sometimes it's negative. So, in another example of this would be on the cultural side. So, we've got a depiction here of the Roman Empire, and they're very famous for having these what's called venatio. So it's basically hunting or killing these animals for entertainment. So, and we've got records of upwards of 10,000 animals that were killed in one day at an event like this. So in at least 300 years, they're aware of more than 1 million animals that were slaughtered in this kind of entertainment setting, and at least 2 species of elephants that were extinct from the Roman Empire. And this was all to show their power. A lot of the animals that they killed were very powerful, large predators. Some other reasons that they often get vilified are to do with our mainstream media. So I did a quick search in a search engine on mountain lion attacks in the United States. And if we click on a lot of these kind of local or media, a lot of times they don't spend much time on the animal's biology or their behaviors, ways to prevent these kinds of interactions, and they spend a lot more time kind of with hyperbolic language that makes things a little more exaggerated. And, you know, they sound like a really dangerous situation. And of course, it can happen, but a lot of times with some more educational outreach, we can potentially prevent some of these negative encounters. So, in another one that I did was typed up animal attack movies. So, and if you guys kind of look a little bit closer at this, sharks are definitely a really popular topic. And of course, Jaws is very famous for that, but we've also got like Lake Placid, so that's about a supposed crocodile species. There's arachnophobia. So a lot of times what's thrown at people about these species are things that are over exaggerated, or it's not even remotely correct information. They are or can be dangerous, but not quite like what's portrayed oftentimes. Okay, and then there's obviously the real and perceived threat of personal injury, and this could be for you, your family members, pets. So we have an example here of a woman who's out on a hike with her pet. And a lot of times, these are concerns that people have. And so just looking at the background of this photo, I'm not sure exactly where she's at, but it looks like she could potentially be in venomous snake habitat, potentially where black bears or mountain lions are. And there's some things that she could do to prevent those potential negative interactions. But also, we have these things happen to folks that are out recreating outdoors. And so, it's one of those things where they have the potential to have a dangerous encounter with a predator or scavenger. And so, we often kind of assume that's always going to be the case when you encounter one of these species. So, but we want to pay attention to why these animals are important and why we should learn more about them. Number one, this species that's up here, I think you guys can probably all figure out what's the one up is at the top. But these animals are typically always the bad guy in the movies and the books, but they don't really deserve that reputation that they have. They're a lot less aggressive than they're made out to be. So that's a common thread with a lot of this. If we learn more, we have less fear. But why do these animals matter in their environments? Well, number one, and kind of one of the easiest ones, is that they're regulating prey populations. So these are animals that literally take out, especially if they're a predator, but they're taking out an individual of a population. So they have that ability to regulate prey. Scavengers can do this a little more indirectly. Their behaviors help affect the dynamics of predator-prey interactions, a lot of times at kill sites. Another important thing is their nutrient cycling. So what does that mean? You eat, at some point you have to poop, right? So these animals are eating this stuff and then they're recycling it back into nature. Natural selection is another big one, particularly for predators that have to expend a lot of energy on hunting something. They're not choosing the healthiest individual most of the time. So they're going after the weaker animals, the sick ones. And then with scavengers as well, they can more indirectly affect it. And again, it has a lot more to do with the behaviors of scavengers when they show up at a potential kill site from another predator. But natural selection is definitely at play. So another huge one is disease control. So again, predators are choosing often individuals that are weak for some reason, and it might be from an illness. So they can potentially help herds of animals, something that's called healthy herd effect. If they're taking out a potentially ill animal, that could spread a disease to the entire herd. And then, of course, scavengers are really amazing at this disease control too. So, and if anybody's familiar with the one, the photo down below, that one in particular, when the population started decline of this species, they saw a massive uptick in the amount of rabies cases in humans and feral dogs. So, very important in curbing rabies spread in its range. But these animals are stopping a lot of pathogens because of their behavior. So, and of course, they're able to help maintain an ecosystem balance just by doing all this stuff. And same thing, they can affect food web dynamics by doing the different behaviors. So all of these things that I've mentioned already, they're able to potentially disrupt a food web in a way that makes room for more biodiversity. They also have intrinsic value. So basically what I mean by that is they don't have to be valuable to humans to deserve to have a place in the world or to live. So they evolved to fill a niche, and so they're, if you think about it, it would be like every single animal having to eat the same thing, and they all have the same behaviors. And at some point, you don't have enough resources. So that's part of why this biodiversity is so important. And of course, there are so many amazing things that we've learned about these animals just by studying them. So, and also dogs, where did we get dogs? And lots of other domesticated species. But think about some of the things that we use. We mimic a lot of what we've seen in nature to help us do things. So airplanes are a perfect example. So, and of course, the species that we have here, we've got gray hawk, and then the bird on the bottom is the Indian vulture. And again, there's some really amazing scientific research done on how they're able to stop spreads of rabies in India. All right, so we're going to dive into some more localized species. And I'm guessing that most of you can probably identify this animal, but it's been kind of a hot topic for Kansas because we just reintroduced this back into its former range in Kansas. And that is the alligator snapping turtle. And I'm going to talk a little bit less about their natural history because we've provided you guys with a supplemental document so you can do some further research on your own. But this is our largest aquatic, aquatic turtle in the United States or North America. So these guys can get pretty massive. I think they believe roughly up to 250 pounds or so for an adult male is possible, and then females get to be around 60 pounds. So it's a very large turtle. And it was historically found in Kansas. We had not seen one in the state since 1991, I believe. And it's one of those species that the main reason for its decline was a couple of big ones for the US, and that is overharvesting, particularly in the further south part of its range. And then the fact that we've got impoundments or dams in so many bodies of water. So in a little aside again, Kansas happens to have the most impoundments, or excuse me, the second most impoundments any state in the United States. We're second only to Texas, which is pretty wild. So basically every little stream that's in Kansas is probably dammed up at some point. And so those kinds of things are not so great for an animal like this. They're considered an apex predator. They're also a scavenger. And some people might not be aware that they're considered omnivorous. So especially as adults, they're eating not so much carnivorous diet as they are including some vegetation. So in a few things that they do, they're keeping prey in check. Just like terrestrial stuff, they're going to help keep prey items in the aquatic systems they live in check. So that allows them to help balance an ecosystem. It's possible where they are, there might be a few less common snapping turtles. So there's a lot more work that needs to be done on those kinds of studies. But they're also removing a lot of carcasses from the water. And amazingly enough, like I said, as an adult, they're eating less of the fish. And they're actually able to help disperse seeds. So they're helping riparian habitat anywhere they exist. So, and of course, they're also a food source for lots of other species, particularly when they're still in the egg, and then, of course, as juveniles. The problem with these guys is it takes them a while to be sexually mature. So that's part of what's harder on conservation efforts is it could be 11 to 21 years before they're old enough to reproduce. But one of my colleagues, Darren Riedel, he took this picture. So this is one of the turtles that was raised in conjunction. We had a partnership with Missouri State University. So they were raised in captivity. And before they were released, they got all kinds of fun gear to help track them. And then they were put in the Verdigris and Neosho watersheds in Kansas. So we're hopefully going to see these guys reestablish. And, as long as they're pretty well left alone, they should do pretty well. So, and I've also provided some more information on the Kansas reintroduction on that document that you guys will have access to. All right, another species. It's actually several. And I have to put this one in here because I run a nature center and I have lots of reptiles at my facility because I have a small facility. So we're not capable of having a lot of other animals that require some more needs and more space. So probably one of the number one things that I hear from most visitors is how much they hate snakes. And it has to do with this particular group, which are the pit vipers. So, and these I will probably go ahead and identify for you guys, but I happen to take all of these photos. So I'm standing fairly close to most of these, and I wasn't in any danger because I was being safe and I wasn't trying to threaten these animals in any way. But the pit viper group includes our rattlesnakes, copperheads, and cottonmouths in the US. We do have other venomous species that are not pit vipers. Those would be animals like the coral snake. They're an elapid. There are some colubrid species that have mild venoms that are not dangerous to humans. But these are the ones that really set people off. And if you ask folks, every snake that they see is probably one of these venomous snakes, but that's definitely not the case. There are lots of other completely harmless species. And these animals are also harmless until we make behavioral choices that threatened their safety and they choose to act upon it. So probably the biggest thing that's important with these is most of them specialize in taking rodents. And why does that matter to us? Well, rodents are a huge pest, right? Residential, they're major agricultural pest. They're also a vector for a lot of really dangerous, I think over 35 diseases that can be passed on to humans, some of which are deadly. And of course, they can reproduce very quickly. So the fact that these animals specialize in taking these small endothermic or warm-blooded animals is really important. Because of this, they're also considered an indicator species. And so what I mean by that is they're organisms whose presence or absence or just their population in general or their health, they can help us figure out what the condition of the environment is. And they're fairly sensitive to changes in their environment. So if we have, high drought conditions, there's not enough prey, then we're going to take notice when we don't see these animals where we expect them. And of course, one of the big things too is the medical applications of studying these animals. And not just for medicines, but if you delve into the evolution of these predators with their prey, they've got all kinds of cool things. Prey animals like kangaroo rats, the reason that they're so athletic has to do with the fact that they're predated on by these really effective predators that use venom. And so this species of snake that's found in northern Texas, the same species up in South Dakota, they may have a totally different venom cocktail because their prey might be a little bit different, or their prey has evolved a way to get around the predation event. So some species actually have immunity to rattlesnake venom or pit viper venom. And so those things are worth studying as well. But obviously, studying their venom allows us to learn a little bit more and be able to better treat when somebody's envenomated. But there's also some really cool things that they do that can help save people's lives. So copperheads, for example, there's studied for their potential, some of the compounds of their venom may be able to attack cancers like breast cancer. There's already medications out there based on components of some of these venomous species that deal with antihypertension or heart medication, anticoagulants, and a whole host of other things. So really cool that we can get all of this life-saving medication potential from an animal like this. And of course, we need them to exist if we're going to capitalize on that. So really quickly, some of these species are not found in our region. The prairie rattlesnake is the one down here in the bottom left. And then this photo was one I took while I was helping collect for the Sternberg Museum in Hayes. They have a live rattlesnake display that's really cool if you guys ever get the chance. And this is a sidewinder. The one over here is a black-tailed rattlesnake, which is probably one of my favorites. And again, I took that photo. We were there with a group of high school biology students, teaching them about biology of the desert Southwest. Then we've got an eastern copperhead. Kansas also has broad-banded copperheads. The one up here in the top is a western diamondback. We do have some in Kansas. We have an introduced population, and we do have some natural movement occurring from Oklahoma now into the southern counties of Kansas. And then our smallest rattlesnake in Kansas, different for you guys in Missouri. You guys have some parts of the state that have a pygmy rattlesnake, but this one here is the Massasauga rattlesnake. So when I took this photo, when I was on a camping trip with my boyfriend, and it was his first time ever seeing a live rattlesnake. But these animals are actually incredible to study. Something else I wanted to mention is some of the cool studies that are out there. This gentleman's name is Cale Morris, and I got the pleasure of meeting him and getting to listen to one of his talks at our Herp Society meeting in Kansas last year. And he obviously gets a lot of the same kind of questions or comments that we do about snakes as well. And a lot of times people assume they're incredibly aggressive animals. And so he came up with a way to test that. And he has a fake leg that he will go out and actually step on rattlesnakes and observe what they do. And come to find out, not very often do they actually strike or bite. So their first response is to get the heck out of there. So we know that these animals are not as aggressive as people make them out to be. I highly recommend checking some of this stuff out. He works for the Phoenix Herpetological Sanctuary. And part of what he does is he actually does trainings to teach people, especially in the desert Southwest, where we have the most amounts of these venomous species. He teaches emergency responders, construction workers, people like that are out in their habitat, how they can safely remove these snakes from where they're working to another location without killing them. So he's very big on safety, and they do a whole lot of cool outreach out that direction. They also have some really cool YouTube videos, so definitely check that out. And then I just wanted to show an example too, that it is possible to be around these animals in a safe way. So we've got an expert here that has tubed this rattlesnake. It happens to be that black-tailed rattlesnake that I have the picture of down below. And these are high school students that were on a camp that I was one of the instructors for, and they're getting to feel this live rattlesnake. So it's a pretty cool thing. And again, they're not as dangerous or aggressive as people make them out to be, but they do have that potential. And so we need to be respectful of these animals, but definitely learn more about them. All right, next one that we want to go over are the vultures. And in our region of the United States, we have two, and I'm sure you guys are familiar with them both. The turkey vulture, which is the one down at the bottom, and then we've got the black vulture up at the top. And both of these are photos that I've taken. I work in Schermerhorn Park, so we're just barely in Kansas, and we actually have historical records that black vultures were nesting. So they were a native species, at least in the southeast portion of Kansas, in the mid-1800s. And then they just disappeared. And they weren't seen again until I think it was like 1989 or the early 90s. The first black vulture seen in modern times in Kansas happened to be at Schermerhorn Park. So what happened? Why did they disappear and now they're back? Well, specifically, especially in the 19th and early 20th centuries, these were animals that were highly persecuted. So we went from, I think it was the 17th or 18th century, they were welcomed at meat markets in the southern portion of the United States that had been settled. And then all of a sudden, there was this change where people thought that they were spreading disease. And of course, we were introducing livestock to the landscape, and they were seen at carcasses. So huge efforts to eradicate them, and they were shot and poisoned. And then other things like some of the toxins in the environment. These animals, both of them were affected by the use of things like DDT. So at one point, we had them in parts of Kansas, and then they had a lot of stuff going against them and they disappeared. So they are can sometimes be a fairly controversial species, but they're so important in cleaning up carcasses. And I hear a lot of folks that aren't so familiar with them make mention of, there's way too many of them and things like that. And one of the things we have to remember is we help with that population boom, and because of how many animals we hit with our vehicles. So that's been a huge help to them. They've really expanded due to human activity. But also they're helping with that disease control. And of course, all of these things that they do, they're helping with ecosystem stability. So this photo here with the poor squirrel that got hit by a car, that was my first time seeing a black vulture in this region when I moved down here. So circa 2013. And at the time you could occasionally run into maybe one or two once a year. And fast forward about 5 or 6 years, oops, and all of a sudden they're expanding. So this photo down in the corner that's not very good, it's pretty blurry. I was coming back from an event and I saw a whole bunch of vultures on the ground eating on a roadkill deer. And I couldn't believe it because of how many there were. There were over 40. And I'd done my eBird report, turned it all in, and one of our kind of old timer historical folks with the Kansas Ornithological Society who's like, Jenn, I think you've probably reported the most of black vultures recorded in Kansas since the time bison roamed. So it's one of those things that's kind of interesting to think about, but we definitely have a major impact on lots of species. But they run into trouble because they're different than their relative, the turkey vulture, in that they will actively hunt, and they're a much more aggressive species. And so that becomes a problem, particularly if you have livestock. And the thing about a lot of the reports with black vultures is a lot of it has to do with anecdotal information. So they're not witnessing a kill, They're seeing the birds at it later. And so this particular species would really benefit from some more studies so we could better mitigate the conflict with them, because there's a lot of money that goes into dealing with these quote unquote nuisance species. But turkey vultures kind of get some of the flack for black vulture activity, but they don't hunt other animals. So they don't have the characteristics or the physical body parts to really to do that. So they oftentimes get accused of killing things, and it's not the turkey vulture. The most problematic thing with turkey vultures is where they choose to roost. And a lot of times water towers, and it's where a lot of municipalities decide to put their swimming pools. And so that becomes a health hazard when all of these turkey vultures are defecating right over a swimming pool. So there's hazing and lots of other things that occur. So, and incidentally, this group, two that were up at the top here, it's hard to see, but they were actually eating on a catfish carcass when I saw them. And I do know that the day before, this animal is what brought the fish up. And I don't know if this bald eagle had killed the catfish or if it found it dead already. But this is a perfect example of a bird that kind of skirts those two categories. It can be predator or it can be the scavenger. Okay, then we've got our number one most wanted animal in North America. Does anybody have a guess on that one? Say if you picked the coyote, then you would be correct. So this is probably our most vilified animal in North America these days. And, you know, it's got a lot of incidents where, you know, it's probably been at fault a lot of times, but then there's a lot of exaggerated stuff as well. But this animal is a mammal that was native more to the drier climates of the United States, so the desert Southwest and our prairie regions. And of course, it was one of the larger carnivores that got persecuted specifically for competition kind of stuff when European settlement occurred. And the problem with this animal is that it didn't act the same way that the other predators did when they started taking them out. So instead of the population going down, this guy has spread. So it is considered a predator, a scavenger, and an omnivore. When I was growing up, we had a neighbor that had a pumpkin patch, and we would regularly see coyotes eating on pumpkin. But they're an incredibly smart animal, highly adaptive, and they are a fission fusion species. So that's part of why our efforts to take their population down by culling them have not worked out so well, is because they're very good at spreading away. And they also kind of have this more skulky behavior. They're a little bit more shy and cautious. They're typically considered a mesopredator, but because we have eradicated a lot of the larger predators where it was found, they've moved into the role as the apex predator in a lot of systems. It's also considered a keystone species. And again, a lot of that has to do with its ability to adapt. So a lot of you may be aware of how well they do in urban settings. So there's really amazing studies out there on these guys living in the middle of Chicago and New York and Los Angeles, and they do really well. So, and these are a couple examples. Again, they were really good at being a prairie species. They're camouflaged for that. This is one that I happened to find on a Christmas bird count as well. But part of the reason they got so vilified had to do, again, with that European settlement into North America. So this animal is incredibly important culturally and religiously with our indigenous peoples. And then we had all these Europeans move in, and you start to see comments that were written down, even by famous authors at the time, like Mark Twain. And they thought it was this kind of ugly, you know, gross, skulky critter. And just a creepy sound and, all of these things. They just didn't like it. And so it was automatically put on that list of we got to get rid of it. And of course, it's a predator. And it was coming up and getting really close to all these people that were moving into places. And interestingly enough, so this picture down here is a coyote pup that I happened to see on a breeding bird survey I was doing, and it's suffering from scabies. And so those are things that get people kind of grossed out by them and other predators now, especially mammals. But humans and the domestic animals we brought over are what brought scabies most likely to the North American continent. So we're responsible for some of the things that have made us kind of feel not so great about these species now. So again, some of the other things that we're learning about them is that they're willing to work with other species. So you've probably seen this information that came from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service about a coyote that was working with an American badger to hunt or find food. So and that's really cool that they're able to do that. But this, again, is another species that we really need to spend more time studying their nature and the biology, because hunting this one or increasing the amount of take with it is not working because it's spread all over and we've not really made a dent in their population. So you might do it at a local level for a short amount of time, but because these animals are fission fusion species, they can separate to protect themselves and then group back together, or they might take over another area that's no longer got a pack. And one of the things that I found interesting talking with a wolf biologist, this gentleman currently works on red wolf conservation and reintroduction in North Carolina. And he also worked on Yellowstone wolf conservation. And he said one of the things that they've found out is one of the easier, or I shouldn't say easy, but one of the more effective ways of keeping their population down or controlling them is to capture coyotes and then sterilize them and then put them back. So they're able to keep numbers of coyotes down in places, especially where they're trying to reintroduce those red wolves. So the problem is it's a pretty intensive way to deal with them. It's a lot easier to shoot, but that isn't working. And so this is a species that to mitigate those conflicts, we really want to study it more. All right. So moving on to why should we care about this stuff? Number one, we've got a lot of evidence out there that anytime an entire species, even if it's not a predator or scavenger, it could be any species, but part of that giant food web, when we remove an entire species, we can have the potential for a whole system to collapse. So why would we intentionally eradicate something if it could potentially affect our own health or a much larger system? So there's also an economic significance. Going back to the coyote, one of the things, it's pretty easy to call in that we've got this nuisance animal and there's not a lot of detailed reporting that occurs, and you've got a justification for spending quite a bit of money for somebody else to go out and remove that animal by culling, basically. So sometimes people are chartering helicopters to take care of these nuisance species. And in some cases, like the coyote, that's actually not an effective way to deal with their population. So on the other side of it, a lot of these animals are incredibly charismatic, and there's this whole ecotourism factor. So people will pay money to see these things in their natural environment. And of course, they're doing so many ecological services for us, and they're saving us a lot of money on things we would have to take care of ourselves. So, and of course, that goes in line with the conflict mitigation. And again, predator killing works for some species as a way to manage populations, but it's not the best way with several species. So there are other ways that we can do this. And all of us benefit for better science and more study on these species and their behaviors and all the factors involved. Something else that we might want to consider too is if you just don't like it, is that a good enough reason to exterminate it? And, you know, particularly with things like snakes, you know, when people don't understand or know what else they do, that's a common feeling that a lot of folks can have. And of course, biodiversity is a really good thing for everybody. Biodiversity, you know, having all these different species that do different things, it helps ecosystems have some resilience and stability when we have environmental changes occur. So extremes in population fluctuations, they're not as bad or dramatic if we've got more biodiversity. Biodiversity can also help with food security, ecosystem services, medicines, and of course, it's part of that intrinsic value. We actually have a lot of evidence that being in nature is good mentally and physically for your body. So it's really important that we appreciate that. And then, of course, there's the potential for new discoveries and that cultural and aesthetic value. So think about like our national symbol. It's both a predator and a scavenger. So an animal that we really should hate if you go by a lot of how we feel about some of these other ones, but it's our national symbol. Think about your local schools and how many of them use a predator or an animal as a mascot. Of course, we have our American river otter there, very charismatic, fun species. So the meat and potatoes of this, what we're hoping to gain by learning more about these, and by an actionable item of hopefully supporting sound science, is that we can protect and these species and therefore have a more healthy environment for all of us. So one of the things that's really important for the science community is we should be striving to seek out diverse perspectives. We should be prioritizing those rigorous scientific methods, make sure people are trained in the scientific method. They're able to have effective communication. They have a strong foundation in critical thinking. They're open to revising hypotheses. They have a healthy amount of skepticism. We shouldn't go into this thinking that we already know what the outcome of a scientific experiment is going to be, because it may not work the way we think. We should stay up to date with what's going on in our field. And of course, we should be humble. And if you're not in the community that's doing the research itself, there are still ways that we can be helpful. And first and foremost, it's being that responsible steward and stakeholder. So there's lots of ways that we can do this. So there's a non-exhaustive list there, but cleanliness, and what I mean by that is a lot of times it's our behaviors and what we do, how we recreate, what our land use is, that attracts these animals closer to us and increases those chances for a negative interaction. So making sure that we're not enticing these animals by what it is we do. Obviously, trying to make sure that we're using the best husbandry and stewardship practices. So sometimes, you know, it's really hard not to go the cheaper or the easier route, and that might be increasing the chance of a bad wildlife conflict. Also, again, try out those non-lethal methods. And again, in particular, sometimes a lethal method is not a solution to the problem. So, and of course, a really big one that we're hoping people will do is spend time reading scientific articles. Go back to your libraries. That's a really good place to get access to scientific articles that you might have to pay for online. And make sure they're peer-reviewed and they've either been accepted by the general scientific community or they've been repeated multiple times and get relatively similar results. So obviously, again, we want to appreciate that these creatures will deserve to have their place in the environment, whether they help us or not. And of course, healthy ecosystems in general are contributing to healthy people. The big one that we can do is our civic duty. And so a few things that you can potentially do is donate monetarily if you can to scientific research. Follow wildlife regulations and laws. They're there for a reason. Participate in community discussions. Make sure you vote. Demand that decisions are based on rigorously tested scientific study. Help educate others if you have that ability. Participate in citizen science. It's a lot of fun. Be conscientious of where you purchase items as well. So in this photo here, hopefully you guys can kind of see it. It's not a great photo. It was taken from the back of a pickup, but I was on a Christmas bird count with a small group. We turned down a road and got to watch this really cool predator-prey interaction. So I'm not sure if everybody can see what's going on, but we've got two animals here. And when we first turned down, we actually thought this was a domestic cat, and it's not. It's one of our native felines, the bobcat. And we got to watch it jump from where it's at, which is more than 6 feet from this eastern cottontail. It jumped straight in the air and landed on it and was able to take it to feast on. So just kind of cool when you get to see those things happen. All right. Okay, and then we want to highlight a couple of really important resources that I hope you guys will check out, and it'll be even cooler if some of you have read these before. And the first one that I wanted to recommend is called Where the Wild Things Were: Life, Death, and the Ecological Wreckage of of Land of Vanishing Predators by William Stolzenberg. So, and this has a really good overall kind of history of how predator study has evolved and some of the hypotheses that have occurred. So if you really like checking out case studies, this is a cool book to read. A lot of really good information. And another one is Coyote America by Dan Flores. So another really good in-depth and goes into a lot of history, like how coyotes have been portrayed or perceived throughout the generations. So those are two that I highly recommend, and they've been added to our resources page that you guys should all have access to. And our animal down here is the eastern amberwing. So, and one of the reasons that I put the dragonfly up is this is the group of predators that has the highest success rate of any predator in the world. So, and if anybody wants to guess, you guys can throw that in the chat too, but they have a 97% success rate when they hunt, which is pretty phenomenal. So the closest one after that, I believe, is the African wild dog. And they have, I think, an 85% success rate, which again, is pretty impressive. All right, so hopefully we have some time for some questions, and that wasn't way too fast for you guys, because there's so much information that we could go through. So, and for anybody interested as well, this is a pallid bat. So one of my favorite bats. And I think I can stop sharing here. So, and you're on mute, Dana.
I hope you can see the little emojis coming up.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yes.
cool.
So when I know too, I saw stuff pop up and I was not able to check out the chat very well. So I'm sorry if you guys had questions throughout, but hopefully we have time to go through a couple before people get off. I know that was pretty much to the end, but
I was looking at the chat, and there's so many really good comments that I'm sure we'll be able to review later as well. I think there's a couple cool things in there, just like people are like, "Wow, I didn't know that," you know. So we're all
yeah,
learning here. I learned a bunch. Dana mentioned trophic cascades and fission fusion species are new terms to her too, so that's really cool.
yeah.
So we had one comment and one question, and then we
Mhm.
can jump to the Q&As. But I thought this was a good comment. Shannon Amiot, religion and ecology as defined by Western society, to clarify, right?
Yeah, that is
Just
a good
just
point.
want to recognize that indigenous relationships with place and our environment were indeed ecology and understood to impact human life before officially defined. And it just brings up so much of the thought of how much indigenous knowledge we've lost an opportunity to pick up
Exactly.
on.
Yes. And I
Yeah.
really appreciate that comment. So that's a very good thing to point out. And not great of me to not really include that, but we coined the term from, more Western culture, but indigenous peoples have understood this for a lot longer. And like you said, we've lost this. And, this kind of culture nowadays is more conquering instead of being a part of the environment. So that's a really good thing to keep in mind.
Awesome. Thank you. And so then Susan Schutz asked, coyote pup, precious. And is scabies fatal to young pups?
So it is something that is actually treatable with antibiotics, but not a lot of people are willing to do that. If they're young, like that particular pup, and they don't get over their scabies infection by the time winter sets, then most likely that animal will die. So a lot of times it is fatal. So if they can get over an infection or it's not really bad in the winter time, then they can get through it. But a lot of times it can be fatal.
Great. Okay. Any other topics in the Q&A? They're easier for us to find out there. Uh, and- I mean, so much great information to contextualize in this presentation. Wow.
I think a lot of people, both in the chat and there's a couple overlapping questions in the Q&A, were about black vultures and about like the USDA programs to help with that, and just sort of like
Right.
your thoughts on the whole black vulture controversy topic.
Yeah. So obviously, again, the ag side of it, they report millions of dollars annually on black vulture depredation, and there are permits that people can put in for so that they can, kind of mitigate some of those problems. The issue with the black vulture problem is again to report that you think the black vulture was involved with a predation event. Um, there's not really detailed way to turn in the information, and a lot of times it's very anecdotal. They didn't witness a kill. So they're seeing these animals as probably the first to show up at a carcass, but it could have been a stillborn or, situation like that. I do know of at least one recent Kansas one where the farmer was watching cattle for another person while he was gone, and they started calving. And about a week after, he witnessed some black vultures pestering the calves that were about a week old. So it's not to say that these things don't happen, but they're probably highly exaggerated. But the other thing is we don't really know what all works to combat that. A lot of it is very simply if you move animals that are getting ready to give birth into an area that's a little more protected, you pretty much completely wipe out that black vulture conflict problem. But that's not feasible for everyone. So there's a lot that can still be learned from that. And there's a few people on the East Coast that are doing some more studies on this, and they're requesting that if anybody thinks that they've had a predation event from a black vulture, they want to necropsy it so they can determine if that's what's actually going on. If they're able to do that. But it just means we need some more scientific research to better understand the dynamics there. So I'm looking at some of the other ones. So Jack has a question about resident populations of wolves and mountain lions in Missouri migrating from adjacent states. So right now, mountain lions are probably what we're going to see establish themselves in some of their former ranges first. And a lot of that movement has to do with where they're in more highly populated areas in their range, like the Rocky Mountains, that's getting taken over by human activity. And so it's kind of forcing some of these animals to move. And these animals have massive territories. So we're getting some of that movement. I expect Kansas will finally have them reestablished, and usually states that had them and they were extirpated, you wait until you have a certain amount of breeding pairs that have been confirmed before they're reestablished as a native species when they've been extirpated. So that's why you might hear some folks that, from state officials that are like, no, we don't have them officially. So you can't just shoot these animals when you see them because they're not considered part of our native list anymore until we've proven that we've got at least, 2, 5, however many for that species of breeding pairs. So wolves, it's a little bit different. Obviously, I think you guys are probably aware that Colorado has done some reintroductions, and it's pretty controversial. They're getting into areas that are a little more populated than like the Yellowstone one. So we've had various individuals show up occasionally. So I'm not sure how long it would take for wolves to show back up. And of course, some of those historically there weren't large populations to begin with. Okay, and then let's see. So, and we've got a question about the alligator snapping turtle. Both male and female don't reproduce until at least 11. I actually would have to go back and look that up on if there's a difference between genders on those. But that is the age range of sexual maturity. So I'd have to go back and look specifically on whether it's different for male or female. But overall, it takes them a little bit longer before they're mature. Another question was about tubing snakes. So basically, there's various sizes of tubes, and you kind of put it in front of the head of a venomous snake and encourage it to, they tend to want to hide into places like that, but you encourage it to sort of move itself into the tube, and as it crawls partway through, then you can actually safely pick it up. So that's tubing them. That's a technique used for people that study them. They put pit tags in these animals, do a lot of different studies, take DNA samples, that kind of thing, and it's totally possible to do that without killing the species. So and then I'm looking at some of these others. So when people take what seems like an easy route to kill unwanted species, too often non-targeted species are killed as well. Yep, that's a really good point there. Regulations to prevent that. Oh, I don't know if I can answer that question really well, talking about the regulations to prevent that and how well those regulations are enforced. Some of it depends on the protections at a state versus a federal level. Obviously, birds in particular are more heavily protected than a lot of other species. And for each state, you might have different protections available. So that would be probably more of a question for somebody that's a little more involved with the regulations side, and then the folks that like are game wardens that are actually seeing violations and how often they're enforcing those. So can't answer that probably as well as you'd want, but there are regulations in place. Obviously, we have species that are allowed to be taken. Those are our game species, and then other species you're not supposed to. A lot of times too, people put in for permits to allow them to do certain activities in areas where they might be causing damage to habitat or inadvertently killing species. So, and basically they pay a fine to combat that. So it's not necessarily the way to go. It kind of depends. I know in some places like Florida, when they're doing construction projects, they're constantly having to relocate an endangered species, their tortoise, the gopher tortoise. And one of the places that they're able to relocate them is an Air Force base so that they've got some protection. So they move a lot of those animals out of the way. So that's another example. Then do I recall a good source of information on medicinal properties of snake venom? There's actually a lot of different information out there, but there's a group called Venom Life, and they have a lot of good information about snake venom and its uses, and it's not just North America. There's a lot of information about snake venom worldwide. So some of the stuff that we might use in medicines, it's actually not species that we find in North America. So cobra, there's some cobra venom that's used potentially for Alzheimer's or neurological disease. So it's pretty vast. That would be something I'd probably have to do a little more looking and can catch up with you later. So if you don't mind and would be willing to, send me an email, and I'd love to do some more research and find you some more resources. And yes, Judy, scabies and mange are the same thing.
Huh.
So, and I'm looking to see if I missed anything. So, and again, Meredith asked about where I work. I actually don't work at a state park. I work at the Southeast Kansas Nature Center, which is in Galena. So I'm just over the border from folks in Joplin. And we're actually inside of a city park called Schermerhorn Park. So we operate the building through Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks, but it's not a state park. Okay, and then I was looking at Kathy Sue. Do you mean mountain lions to reestablish sooner than wolf because of reintroduction or natural population growth? So that one, I don't probably have enough background information on any reintroduction. Kansas has not done reintroduction of mountain lions. So what we are seeing is natural movement. And most likely they're being pushed from the Rocky Mountain region when, there's lots of houses that go up in those areas where these animals live. So, and then of course, natural disasters and things like that can also occur. Missouri, I'm not sure where all of yours comes from. They're probably from a little further north, but it's going to be very similar. And I actually don't know if you guys have done reintroduction. So black bears, though, that would be, we've started to see those move in to Kansas more, and that's due to reintroductions that occurred in Arkansas more than 50 years ago now at this point. So, and the Schermerhorn Cave, you can go to the twilight area of the cave. You cannot enter, and that's because the salamanders that utilize that cave are considered threatened and endangered in Kansas. And it's also white nose syndrome positive, so we don't want to spread that fungal disease to any other cave systems. So is there anything else that I
think we got
answered,
a lot
or
of them.
anything that I missed? So like I said, that was a whole lot of information really fast, but I hope that you guys take the opportunity to ask me any questions that you have via email if you want. Provided that, I love looking up stuff that I don't necessarily know myself too. So, but I highly recommend checking out those resources as a way to kind of get you versed in some of the different scientific studies going on regarding predators and scavengers.
Wow. Thank you for this. It's
Yeah.
really you've helped thread the needle through our learning series on
Yeah.
these connections, and everything is connected. And it makes us think of those mind-changing moments when you get new information about something,
Oh,
and
absolutely.
and it makes me think of all the Leopold and the Green Fire.
Oh, yes. Boy, and talk about a tearjerker moment there. But that's it's a great example. And again, there's some really cool programs out there. I can't think of it off the top of my head, but there's documentary programs that talk about this. So another example that we aren't as familiar with, grizzly bears, when they're in scavenger mode during salmon season, when the salmon move in to breed and then they're dying, they are really important scavengers to the Pacific Northwest temperate forests. And the fact that they're bringing salmon further away into deeper portions of the forest, those forest areas that have that kind of interaction going on, they're healthier than ones that don't have grizzlies moving, and these other predators and scavengers moving salmon in. So, and they've done studies, and basically everything in those systems have a little bit of salmon DNA in them. So they're very important. A lot of cool stuff that's all connected for sure.
Jen, lots of nice comments in the chat. Biodiversity is the key. So folks, just to make sure everyone sees it, we put the link a few times. Jen made a really nice resource document for this presentation for us. So please, there's the link in the chat. It's now not very far from the bottom. It's in there a few times, so I hope everybody grabbed it.
Yeah, and again, those two books in particular, they're going to give you a really good foundation of ecology as well, and a lot of scientific concepts. So anything that I've been talking about that you're like, I don't really know where she's going with that, that's part of why, because otherwise we would have been here for 3 hours or more.
All right, if we're
Thank you
not
all.
seeing any more, questions or chats, we'll let everybody go. John, thanks so much.
Yeah,
I
thank
learned
you
a
guys
ton.
so much for joining us, and everybody stay safe and warm with this new snowstorm coming through. So
Thank you
appreciate you
all.
joining.
Good night, everybody. Thanks, Jen.